The universe had been screaming for 11 months. Across 17 star systems, the sound of war echoed through the void, plasma cannons painting aurora death across the darkness, quantum torpedoes tearing holes in reality itself, the desperate communications of dying civilizations broadcast on frequencies that carried their agony to distant worlds. The hegemony of ascendant races had grown accustomed to the symphony of conquest, the familiar rhythm of superior firepower crushing primitive resistance. But the humans had taught them a new kind of music, the kind that played in the spaces between heartbeats. In the moment before you realized you were already dead, High Admiral Zix Thura of the Navaxi Supremacy Division stood before the crystalline command interface of her flagship, watching tactical displays that told stories she refused to believe. Her serpentine form coiled around the control nexus with predatory grace, 6 cybernetic arms manipulating data streams that painted an impossible picture of the ongoing campaign. The Navaxi had ruled the Galactic Northwest Quadrant for 2 millennia, their biomechanical fusion technology allowing them to merge consciousness with their war machines, becoming living weapons of unparalleled sophistication. They were death given form and purpose, evolution's perfect answer to the question of how to wage war among the stars. They had never lost a conflict. Until now. Display the Dragon's Edge engagement. Zix Thura commanded, her voice carrying the harmonic frequencies that resonated through her ship's neural networks. The holographic projector hummed to life, reconstructing the battle that had taken place 72 hours ago in perfect, horrifying detail. Dragon's Edge, a fortress system that had never fallen in 800 years of intermittent warfare, protected by gravitational anomalies and defended by the Gorthani siege clans, warriors whose genetic modifications made them living siege engines. The humans had taken it in 4 hours and 17 minutes. Analysis confirms the tactical recordings are accurate, reported Subcommander Vaxakari, her biomechanical implants glowing with the cold light of processed data. Human casualties, 12 wounded, 0 fatalities. Gorthani casualties, 4,307 killed in action, 8,000 wounded. Impossible numbers that spoke to a kind of warfare that violated every principle the hegemony understood about conflict resolution. "Show me the weapon signatures," Zix Thura demanded. That's the problem, High Admiral. There aren't any." The hologram shifted, displaying energy readings from the battle zone, where there should have been massive particle discharge patterns, exotic matter residue, the electromagnetic signatures of advanced weaponry deployed on a planetary scale. There was nothing. Clean space. Pristine readings. As if the battle had been fought with weapons that existed in dimensions the Navaxi instruments couldn't detect. "Stealth technology," suggested Tactical Coordinator Hexmora, his chitinous features clicking with uncertainty. "Some form of cloaking system that masks energy signatures." Zix Thura's serpentine head swayed in the negative gesture of her species. Stealth technology was expensive, energy-intensive, and ultimately limited in scope. No civilization could cloak enough firepower to devastate a fortress world without leaving some trace of their presence. "Show me the Terran fleet deployment patterns," she commanded. The display shifted again, showing the distribution of human vessels throughout the contested regions. What she saw made her cybernetic implants pulse with algorithmic confusion. The humans scattered their forces like seeds on stellar winds, with no apparent regard for defensive positioning or supply line security. Their capital ships operated independently, often light years from the nearest support vessels. Their logistics trains followed routes that exposed them to constant attack. Their communication networks relied on quantum entanglement arrays that any competent military force should have been able to disrupt. It was tactical madness on a scale that should have resulted in their complete annihilation within weeks. Instead, they had methodically dismantled every defense the hegemony could deploy. "High Admiral," came a voice from the communications array. "Priority transmission from the War Council. Highest encryption protocols." The hologram resolved into the familiar image of Supreme War Master Nixtaran, the ancient Navaxi, whose consciousness had been merged with the hegemony's primary strategic coordination matrix for the past 3 centuries. His form existed partially in physical space and partially in quantum dimensional overlap, creating a visual effect that spoke to power beyond mortal comprehension. "Zix Thura," he began, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through multiple reality layers simultaneously. "I have new intelligence regarding the human military structure." The High Admiral's 6 arms moved in the ritual acknowledgement patterns of formal military communication. "Supreme War Master, our deep reconnaissance units have penetrated Terran communication networks. What we discovered challenges everything we believed we understood about their civilization." The projection shifted, displaying intercepted human military documents translated through advanced linguistic matrices, classification levels, unit designations, force deployment schedules. "The forces we have been fighting," Nixtaran continued, "the soldiers who have been systematically destroying our most fortified positions, eliminating our elite units, and conquering worlds that should have been unconquerable." He paused, and Zixfera could sense through the quantum link that even this ancient intelligence was struggling to process the implications of what he was about to reveal. "These forces represent what the humans classify as their standard military, their regular army, their baseline combat units." The word struck the command bridge like a physical force. Every Nivaxi present, beings whose consciousness was enhanced by direct neural interface with their ship's tactical computers, fell into stunned silence. "Standard military," Zixthera repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "According to their organizational documents, the Terran military maintains specialized divisions for exceptional circumstances, units trained for scenarios that exceed the operational parameters of their regular forces." The projection shifted again, showing a classification designation that made Zux's cybernetic systems pulse with error warnings. "Terrian Special Operations Forces, classified beyond enemy intelligence capabilities. They call them Special Forces," Nixtaran said, his multidimensional voice carrying undertones of something that might have been fear. "And according to our analysis, they're being deployed to the front lines." Deployment timeline: 48 hours. The silence that followed was profound enough to hear the quantum fluctuations in the ship's power systems. 48 hours to discover what humans considered dangerous enough to require forces beyond their already impossible standard military. 48 hours to learn what evolution looked like when it stopped pretending to play by the rules. Lieutenant Colonel Alexandra Stone had been stationed on 11 different worlds during her 15-year military career, had fought battles in conditions that ranged from Arctic wastelands to molten hellscapes, had faced enemies that represented the worst nightmares of a dozen different species. But as she stood in the briefing room aboard the UES Prometheus, looking at intelligence reports that painted a picture of an enemy that simply refused to acknowledge the reality of their situation, she felt something she had rarely experienced in her professional life: pity. The holographic display showed the current disposition of hegemony forces throughout the outer reach sectors. Millions of soldiers, thousands of ships, enough firepower to sterilize entire star systems, all of it positioned to defend against what their leaders obviously believed would be humanity's next escalation in destructive capability. They were preparing for a war that wasn't coming. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, addressing the mixed assembly of officers from the 3rd Special Operations Division. "Our mission parameters have been updated based on enemy intelligence intercepts." The projection shifted, showing classified hegemony communications that had been acquired through methods Stone wasn't cleared to discuss. What mattered was the content: detailed assessments of human military capability, strategic predictions based on observed patterns, tactical preparations designed to counter expected human responses. All of it wrong. All of it based on assumptions that revealed more about hegemony thinking than about human intentions. "The enemy believes we're deploying enhanced combat forces," she continued. "They're expecting super soldiers, advanced weapons systems, some kind of technological escalation that represents our response to their defensive improvements." Major Carlos Mendez, the unit's senior intelligence analyst, raised his hand. "Colonel, have they made any attempt to understand our actual operational doctrine?" Stone's smile carried no humor whatsoever. "Major, they've spent 11 months trying to understand how our standard forces could be so effective. They've developed elaborate theories about our technology, our tactics, our strategic philosophy. What they've never considered is that our effectiveness doesn't come from being better at war." She gestured to the tactical displays showing hegemony fleet positions, defensive formations, preparation for battles that would never be fought according to their expectations. It comes from being better at everything else. The room fell silent as the officers processed the implications. These were special operations personnel, men and women whose training went far beyond conventional military parameters, whose skills encompassed disciplines that traditional warriors never considered. Our deployment zone is the Kethmanor system, Stone continued, bringing up detailed charts of the contested region. 7 inhabited worlds, total population approximately 47 million mixed hegemony species. Strategic value minimal, current military significance. They're expecting us to demonstrate whatever new capabilities they think we possess. What are our actual objectives, Colonel? Asked Captain Jennifer Kim, the unit's senior medical officer. Stone's smile became genuine for the first time during the briefing. We're going to give them exactly what they're afraid of, Captain. We're going to show them what human special forces are actually capable of. The projection shifted one final time, showing deployment schedules, supply manifests, and operational parameters that told a story completely different from what any hegemony intelligence analyst would expect. Advanced medical equipment, engineering systems, communications arrays designed for civilian infrastructure support, food distribution networks, water purification systems, educational materials translated into 17 different languages. Our mission, Stone announced, is to render 7 worlds completely incapable of continuing hostilities. How, Colonel? By making them not want to fight anymore. The first sign that something unprecedented was happening came through civilian communication channels rather than military networks. Dr. Quenthera had been working as a trauma surgeon in the refugee camps on Kethmanor's third moon for the better part of 2 years, treating the endless stream of casualties that came from living in a contested war zone. Her forearms moved with practiced efficiency as she tended to wounds that spoke to the casual brutality of interstellar conflict, plasma burns, radiation sickness, the psychological damage that came from watching entire communities destroyed by forces beyond anyone's ability to resist. The hegemony military provided basic medical support for civilian populations, but their resources were stretched thin across 17 active theaters of war. Most of her patients received minimal treatment before being shipped to overcrowded facilities on worlds that were already struggling to support their own populations. It was a system designed for survival, not healing. For endurance, not hope. So, when her communication system activated with an incoming transmission using quantum encryption protocols she'd never encountered before, her first assumption was that some new catastrophe was requiring her immediate attention. The holographic image that resolved in her medical bay was not what she expected. The human female wore military uniform, but her insignia were unlike anything in Quenthera's extensive database of Terran military organization. Medical cross symbols combined with engineering classifications and communication specialist designations, a mixture that suggested interdisciplinary training beyond normal military parameters. Dr. Quenthera, the human said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to emergency situations. This is Major Patricia Washington, 3rd Special Operations Division, Humanitarian Support Branch. We've been monitoring medical conditions in your sector. Humanitarian support. The words made no sense in the context of military operations. Combat medics existed to treat wounded soldiers. Field hospitals were established to maintain unit effectiveness, but humanitarian support suggested something else entirely. Medical care provided not for tactical advantage but simply because it was needed. Major Washington, Quenthera replied carefully. I'm not sure I understand your purpose here. Doctor, our intelligence indicates your medical facilities are operating at 400% of designed capacity. Your pharmaceutical supplies are critically low. Your surgical equipment hasn't been maintained in 8 months due to parts shortages. The accuracy of the assessment was startling. Those were precise details that should have been available only through detailed reconnaissance or direct observation. We're prepared to provide immediate medical support, Washington continued. Full pharmaceutical resupply, advanced surgical equipment, additional medical personnel if you're willing to accept them. In exchange for what? The question seemed to puzzle the human major. Doctor, there's no exchange. We're offering medical aid because people need it. Is there some other reason we should need? Quenthera's forearms moved in the gesture of profound confusion. In her experience, Military forces provided support only when it served tactical purposes, treating wounded soldiers, maintaining civilian morale in occupied territories, demonstrating power through displays of technological superiority, never simply because suffering existed and could be alleviated. Major, forgive my confusion, but are you saying your special forces include medical support personnel whose primary mission is to provide aid to enemy civilian populations? Doctor, Washington replied, and Quintera could hear something in the human's voice that she had never encountered in 2 years of dealing with military personnel. We prefer to think of them as people who haven't been given a chance to stop being enemies yet. The transmission ended, leaving Quintera alone in her medical bay with equipment that was failing, supplies that were exhausted, and patients who needed care she couldn't provide. 6 hours later, the first human medical transport appeared in orbit around Cathaminer's third moon. It was followed by 17 others. And as Dr. Quintera watched advanced medical equipment being unloaded by soldiers whose weapons remained holstered, whose behavior suggested they were more concerned with proper sterile procedure than with defensive positioning, she began to understand that the hegemony had made a fundamental error in their assessment of human military capability. They had assumed that special forces meant more dangerous. They had never considered that it might mean more capable of choosing when not to be dangerous at all. High Admiral Zuxfera received the first reports 36 hours after the human deployment began. Status unclear was becoming a phrase that appeared with disturbing frequency in tactical assessments throughout the Kith Minor system. Not enemy contact established or casualties sustained or any of the standard language that described military engagements. Simply status unclear, as if her field commanders were encountering situations their training hadn't prepared them for. "Show me real-time surveillance from the primary population centers," she commanded. The holographic display flickered to life, showing overhead reconnaissance footage from 7 worlds simultaneously. What she saw challenged every assumption she had made about human military doctrine. Instead of establishing fortified positions, the human forces were dispersing throughout civilian population centers. Instead of targeting military installations, they were focusing on infrastructure that had been damaged during months of conflict. Instead of demonstrating superior firepower, they were building things: hospitals, schools, water treatment facilities, communications networks. "Are we certain these are military personnel?" asked Commander Vexkari, her biomechanical systems processing the surveillance data with increasing algorithmic confusion. "Confirmed through multiple intelligence sources," came the reply from the Tactical Coordination Center. "These are the same human special forces units that were deployed with such significant security protocols. Advanced training, elite personnel, specialized equipment." Specialized for what? The question hung in the artificial atmosphere of the command bridge like a toxic gas. Because the answer, based on observed behavior patterns, seemed to be that human special forces were specialized for activities that had nothing to do with warfare as the hegemony understood it. "High Admiral," announced the communications officer, "priority transmission from Ground Commander Rickgreth Thole on Cathaminer Prime. He's requesting immediate guidance regarding unusual enemy behavior." The projection resolved into the image of one of the hegemony's most experienced field commanders, Inavaxi, whose biomechanical enhancements had been optimized for ground combat operations. His serpentine features carried an expression that Zythara had never seen before: complete bewilderment. "High Admiral," he began, "the human forces have made contact with our defensive perimeter." "Casualties?" "None, Admiral, that's the problem." Azixthara's 6 arms moved in the gesture that indicated the need for clarification. "Explain." "They approached our forward positions under a white flag. Standard diplomatic protocols. When our sentries prepared to engage, they requested permission to treat our wounded." The words made no tactical sense. Treating enemy wounded was a humanitarian gesture with no military value, something that consumed resources while providing aid to forces that would return to combat effectiveness and resume hostilities. "They offered to share medical supplies," Raxful continued, "to provide technical assistance with our communications equipment that was damaged in last week's skirmish, to help repair our defensive position." "Our defensive positions?" "Yes, Admiral. They pointed out structural weaknesses in our fortifications and offered engineering support to improve our defensive capabilities. Zixthera felt her cybernetic systems pulse with error warnings. The scenario Rixtheras was describing violated every principle of military engagement she had learned in 2 centuries of warfare. Commander, are you saying the human special forces are offering to help us fight them more effectively? That appears to be an accurate assessment, Admiral. The silence that followed was profound enough to hear the quantum processing cycles of the ship's computer cores. Finally, Zixthera found her voice. What did you tell them? I didn't know what to tell them. Admiral, this situation isn't covered in our tactical manuals. Through the quantum link she could sense Ruxithiel's confusion spreading to his entire command structure. Soldiers who had been prepared for battle finding themselves offered assistance by enemies who treated warfare like a collaborative problem-solving exercise. Admiral, Ruxithiel continued, there's something else. The human commander, a Colonel Stone, said that if we needed time to consult with higher authority, they would be happy to establish temporary medical facilities for both military and civilian populations while we made our decision. Both military and civilian? Yes, Admiral. She said that medical emergencies don't respect the boundaries of military engagement, and that suffering was suffering regardless of which uniform someone wore. Zixthera closed her optical sensors and tried to process what she was learning about human military doctrine. Special forces that offered aid to enemies. Warriors who treated civilian welfare as equally important to military objectives. Soldiers whose idea of tactical advantage seemed to include making sure everyone involved in the conflict received appropriate medical care. Commander, she said finally, what are our casualty projections if we accept their assistance? Medical casualties would drop by approximately 70%. Admiral, infrastructure damage would be repaired within days rather than months. Communication effectiveness would improve dramatically, and our combat effectiveness, unknown, Admiral. But the human colonel suggested that healthy, well-equipped soldiers make better opponents, and that she preferred fighting enemies who were at full capability rather than those who had been weakened by preventable circumstances. She preferred fighting enemies who were at full strength. Zixthera opened her optical sensors and looked out at the stars that had once seemed so familiar, now appearing alien and strange in light of what she was learning about the species humanity had become. Somewhere out there, human special forces were redefining the very concept of warfare by treating their enemies with the same care they showed their own people. And the most terrifying part was that it seemed to be working. The war was still raging across 17 star systems. But in the Kathmanor system, something else entirely was beginning to emerge. Something that would teach the galaxy what the word special really meant. 3 days after first contact in the Kathmanor system, the hegemony's military doctrine began to collapse. Not through defeat. There had been no battles, no casualties, no destruction of strategic assets. Instead, something far more insidious was happening. Their soldiers were beginning to question why they were fighting at all. Commander Rexthus stood in what had once been his forward command post, watching human engineers work alongside his own technical specialists to repair communication equipment that had been damaged in weeks of sporadic skirmishing. The scene should have triggered every security protocol in his enhanced consciousness, should have sent warning signals cascading through his biomechanical systems. Instead, he found himself studying the efficiency with which former enemies collaborated on solving mutual problems. "Commander," called Lieutenant Hexvara, from the medical station that had been established in the eastern sector of their defensive perimeter. "The human medical team is requesting permission to expand their treatment facility. They're seeing more patients than their current setup can accommodate. Patients, not prisoners, not casualties. Patients whose medical needs transcended the political boundaries that had brought them to this contested world in the first place. Expansion for what purpose?" Rixtidal asked, though he already knew the answer. "They want to add a pediatric wing, sir. Apparently there are refugee children who need specialized care that our field medical units aren't equipped to provide." Rexful's serpentine head swayed in the gesture of deep thought. The logical part of his consciousness, the part enhanced by decades of military conditioning, insisted that this was some kind of elaborate deception, that the humans were using humanitarian gestures to gather intelligence to position assets for some future tactical advantage. to manipulate hegemony forces into compromising positions. But the evidence was becoming harder to ignore. If this was deception, it was the most resource-intensive, strategically counterproductive deception in the history of galactic warfare. "Lieutenant," he said finally, "tell the human medical team they have permission to expand their facilities as needed." "Sir, should I inform High Command of this decision?" Riksthul considered the question. 3 days ago he would have immediately reported any contact with enemy forces to his superiors. Now the thought of reducing the humanitarian operation in the Kethmanar system to tactical data points and casualty assessments felt like a betrayal of something he couldn't quite define. "I'll handle communication with High Command," he said. "Focus on coordinating with the medical teams." As Hexavera departed to relay the authorization, Riksthul activated his personal communication system and opened a channel to the human colonel who had somehow transformed a military engagement into a collaborative aid mission. Colonel Stone's image resolved in his display, transmitting from what appeared to be a field hospital rather than a military command center. Behind her, he could see human medics working alongside hegemony medical personnel, their movements synchronized with the kind of efficiency that came from shared purpose rather than imposed cooperation. "Commander Riksthul," she said with what appeared to be genuine pleasure, "I understand you're approving expansion of our medical facilities." "Thank you, Colonel. I have a question that I hope you'll answer honestly." "Of course. What is your actual mission here?" Stone was quiet for a moment, and Riksthul could see her considering not just his question but the implications behind it. "Commander," she said finally, "our mission is to demonstrate that warfare doesn't have to be the only method of resolving conflicts between civilizations. By providing medical aid to your enemies, by proving that we don't have to be enemies at all." The simplicity of the statement struck Riksthul like a physical blow. In his 2 centuries of military service, he had never encountered a strategic philosophy based on the premise that conflicts could be resolved through means other than the application of superior force. "Colonel, your people have been fighting the hegemony for 11 months. Battles have been fought, territory has been contested, casualties have been sustained on both sides. How do you reconcile that with your current approach?" Stone's expression became more serious, and Riksthul could see something in her eyes that spoke to profound conviction. "Commander, everything that's happened over the past 11 months was necessary to bring us to this moment. Not because we wanted to prove we could defeat you, but because we needed to prove we could choose not to." "I don't understand. Your people, all the species in the hegemony, you've never encountered a civilization that possessed overwhelming military superiority and chose restraint over conquest. You had to see that we were capable of winning before you could believe that we were choosing not to." The implications of what she was saying began to cascade through Riksthul's enhanced consciousness. The human military campaigns, the tactical victories, the demonstration of capabilities that had redefined galactic understanding of warfare, all of it had been preparation for this moment. All of it had been designed to create the credibility necessary for an offer of peace. "So your special forces," he began, "are specialists in ending wars rather than winning them," Stone finished. "We're trained in medical support, engineering, education, agriculture, communications, conflict resolution, and about 40 other disciplines that have nothing to do with destroying enemy assets. Then why call them military units at all?" Colonel Stone smiled, and Riksthul could see in that expression something that would haunt his understanding of human nature for the rest of his extended life. "Because sometimes you have to be strong enough to fight a war before anyone will listen to your reasons for not fighting it." But Strutya had worked in refugee camps on 7 different worlds during her long career, had seen the aftermath of conflicts that spanned decades and consumed entire star systems. She understood the rhythm of war, the initial displacement, the struggle for resources, the gradual adaptation to conditions that no sentient being should have to endure. What was happening in the Kethmanar system didn't follow any pattern she recognized. The human medical teams had arrived with equipment that surpassed anything she had seen in civilian medical facilities, let alone military field hospitals. Their pharmaceutical supplies included medications for conditions that most military medics wouldn't even know how to diagnose. Their surgical capabilities rivaled those of major medical centers on core worlds. But more disturbing than their technological superiority was their approach to patient care. "Ah, Dr. Quintera, called Major Washington from the pediatric wing that had been completed in less than 48 hours. We've identified 17 children who need educational support in addition to medical treatment. Do we have your permission to establish classroom facilities, educational support? Classroom facilities. The words made no sense in the context of a war zone. Major, these children are refugees from a conflict zone. Surely their immediate medical needs should take priority over academic concerns. Washington's expression carried the patient understanding of someone who had encountered this confusion before. Doctor, trauma recovery in juveniles is significantly improved when their routine includes educational activities. Children need to feel that they have a future worth preparing for. Learning is hope given practical application. The human major paused, studying data on her portable medical scanner. Additionally, many of these children have been separated from their families during the evacuation process. Educational activities provide social structure and emotional stability while we work to reunite family units. Family reunification. Social structure. Emotional stability. When Tara realized she was listening to a military officer discuss civilian welfare using terminology that belonged in graduate-level social work courses, not battlefield medical assessments. Major Washington, what exactly were you trained for before being assigned to special operations? I have advanced degrees in emergency medicine, child psychology, educational theory, and conflict resolution. Washington replied. Most of my colleagues have similar interdisciplinary backgrounds. The theory is that solving complex problems requires understanding all the systems involved, not just the ones that relate to immediate tactical concerns. So you're saying that human special forces are social workers? Washington's laugh was genuine and completely without mockery. Dr. Quintara, we prefer to think of ourselves as people who learned that the most effective way to win a war is to address the underlying reasons why people think they need to fight. The reports reaching High Admiral Zygurthara's flagship had taken on the quality of fevered dreams. Medical facilities being constructed by enemy forces, educational programs being established for refugee children, agricultural specialists working to restore farming communities that had been displaced by months of conflict, infrastructure repair projects that would take our own engineers weeks to complete being finished by human technical teams in days. And through it all, not a single shot fired in anger, not a single act of aggression, not a single indication that the human special forces were preparing for any kind of military engagement. Sub-Commander Vaxkari, she called to her intelligence specialist, I want a complete analysis of human force deployment throughout the Kathmaner system. Every unit, every specialist, every piece of equipment. Analysis complete, High Admiral, came the reply almost immediately. The data is unusual. Display it. The holographic projection showed a detailed breakdown of human personnel and equipment throughout 7 worlds. What Zygurthara saw challenged every assumption about military force composition she had learned in 2 centuries of warfare. Medical personnel, 84-7 individuals with advanced specializations in trauma surgery, psychological counseling, pediatric care, and exotic biology. Engineers, 580 individuals trained in infrastructure repair, environmental restoration, and civilian construction projects. Agricultural specialists, 23-4 individuals with expertise in soil restoration, crop management, and food distribution logistics. Educational personnel, 56 individuals with training in curriculum development, language instruction, and youth counseling. Communication specialists, 78 individuals focused on civilian network restoration and cross-cultural information exchange. Sub-Commander Zygurthara said slowly, Where are the combat specialists? High Admiral, according to our analysis, every individual in the human deployment has combat training that meets or exceeds our standards for elite military personnel, but their primary specializations appear to be in civilian support roles. Zygurthara's 6 arms moved in the ritual gestures of deep contemplation. She was looking at a military force that had been designed not to fight wars but to repair the damage that wars created. What are their weapons capabilities? Minimal, Admiral, personal defense equipment only. No heavy weapons, no artillery, no orbital strike capabilities. If they were attacked, their defensive options would be extremely limited. Are they expecting to be attacked? No, Admiral. Their deployment patterns suggest complete confidence that no hostile action will be taken against them. The implications were staggering. The human special forces were operating under the assumption that their humanitarian activities would protect them better than military defensive measures. They were treating enemy territory as if it were Allied space. They were acting as if the war was already over. "Hi, Admiral," announced the communications officer. "Priority transmission from Supreme War Master Nixtharan. Highest classification protocols." The hologram resolved into the multidimensional image of the ancient Navaxi consciousness that had been guiding hegemony's strategic planning for 3 centuries. "Zex Sarah," he began, his quantum-enhanced voice carrying undertones of something she had never heard from him before: uncertainty. "Supreme War Master, the situation in the Kethamanar system is creating complications throughout our command structure. Field commanders in 17 other sectors are reporting unusual communications from their counterparts in the affected region." "What kind of communications?" "Requests for authorization to accept humanitarian aid. Inquiries about establishing medical cooperation protocols. Questions about whether current military objectives are compatible with civilian welfare considerations." Submeta felt her biomechanical systems pulse with alarm. The human approach to warfare was spreading like a virus through the hegemony's military hierarchy, causing commanders throughout the fleet to question fundamental assumptions about the nature of conflict. "Supreme War Master, are you saying that exposure to human special forces operations is affecting the loyalty of our personnel?" "Not their loyalty, Zaxthara. Their understanding of what loyalty means." The distinction was subtle but profound. Loyal soldiers who discovered that their enemies were more concerned with civilian welfare than with military advantage would inevitably begin to question which side truly deserved their allegiance. "There's something else," Nixtharan continued. "We've intercepted human communications discussing deployment of additional special forces units to other contested systems. They're calling it Operation Reconciliation. Reconciliation. A systematic application of humanitarian assistance to every active theater of war, medical support, infrastructure repair, educational programs, agricultural aid, everything they've been doing in the Kathminer system, expanded to encompass the entire conflict zone." Zixthara closed her optical sensors and tried to process the scope of what the humans were proposing. Not a military campaign designed to defeat enemy forces, but a humanitarian campaign designed to eliminate the conditions that made people want to fight. "Supreme War Master," she said finally, "what are our response options?" "That's why I'm contacting you directly. Zexithara, for the first time in 3 centuries of strategic planning, I don't have an answer to that question." The silence that followed carried the weight of civilizations balanced on the edge of fundamental change. "The humans have found something we never looked for," Nixtharan continued. "A way to win wars without fighting them. A way to defeat enemies by refusing to treat them as enemies." Through her flagship's observation ports, Zixthara could see the lights of human vessels moving between the worlds of the Kathminer system. Not in military formation, but in the patterns of civilian traffic, as if they belonged in this space, as if they had always been welcome here. "Supreme War Master, what happens if we choose to resist this reconciliation?" "Then we become the aggressors." "Did Satvara. We become the civilization that chooses violence over cooperation, destruction over construction, warfare over the possibility of peace. And if we accept it, then we discover what the galaxy looks like when conflicts are resolved through understanding rather than conquest." The transmission ended, leaving Zixthara alone with the most dangerous question in her species' history. What do you do when your enemy's greatest weapon is their refusal to treat you like an enemy? Colonel Stone stood in the observation dome of the UES Reconciliation, looking down at the lights of Kethmanor Prime spreading across the planet's surface like bioluminescent patterns in an organic neural network. 72 hours ago, those lights had marked military installations, defensive positions, and refugee camps arranged around a fortress world preparing for siege. Now they marked hospitals, schools, and residential communities where former enemies worked together to build something neither side had imagined possible. "Colonel," came a voice behind her. She turned to see Major Mendez approaching with a datapad containing the latest intelligence reports from across the 17-system conflict zone. "What's our status, Major?" Operation Reconciliation is exceeding all projection parameters, he reported. Humanitarian deployments to 14 additional systems have been authorized by local hegemony commanders. Resistance has been minimal. Define minimal. 3 instances of initial skepticism that were resolved through medical cooperation protocols. 1 case of attempted sabotage that was abandoned when the perpetrator realized we were treating his wounded comrades. Stone nodded. The pattern was consistent with psychological assessments that had predicted how different species would respond to humanitarian approaches to conflict resolution. Any indication that Hegemony High Command is preparing military countermeasures? Negative, Colonel. Intelligence suggests they're experiencing what our xenopsychologists call paradigm paralysis. They can't develop countermeasures because they can't understand what we're actually doing. They can't fight something that isn't fighting them. Exactly. Stone looked back at the peaceful lights below, thinking about the reports she would send to Earth Command. 18 months of conventional warfare had demonstrated human military superiority. 72 hours of humanitarian engagement had demonstrated something more important, human moral superiority. Major, there's something I want you to include in your next intelligence brief to the fleet. Yes, Colonel. The hegemony species aren't evil. They're not monsters. They're people who evolved in different circumstances, developed different cultural solutions to survival, and made different choices about how to interact with other civilizations. She paused, watching a transport shuttle land at what had once been a military airfield and now served as a coordination center for refugee services. Our mission isn't to defeat them. It's to offer them the choice to become something better than what this war has made them. And if they choose not to change, Stone's smile carried the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years learning that most people, when given the choice between conflict and cooperation, would choose cooperation if they believed it was genuinely possible. Then we keep offering. Major, we keep demonstrating that another way is possible. We keep treating them like people who deserve better than war until they start believing it themselves. Through the observation dome's transpersteel, they could see the running lights of hegemony vessels beginning to move in coordinated patterns with human ships. Not military formations, but the kind of cooperative logistics that happened when people worked together toward common goals. The war was ending. Not through victory or defeat, but through the revolutionary discovery that enemies could choose to stop being enemies. And somewhere in the command centers of both civilizations, military strategists were beginning to understand that they were witnessing the birth of an entirely new form of warfare, one where the greatest weapon was the wisdom to know when not to use any weapons at all. The galaxy would never be the same. The surrender came on a Tuesday. High Admiral Zaxthera stood in the council chamber of her flagship, surrounded by holographic displays showing real-time intelligence from 47 star systems where something unprecedented was happening. Spontaneous peace. Not negotiated truces or strategic withdrawals, but the organic cessation of hostilities as military personnel throughout the hegemony discovered that their supposed enemies were more interested in treating their wounded than in inflicting new casualties. Final casualty assessment, she requested. Though she already knew the numbers would challenge everything her species understood about the mathematics of warfare. Human casualties during Operation Reconciliation. 0 combat fatalities. 17 injuries sustained during humanitarian activities, reported Sub-Commander Vex Carey. Hegemony casualties during the same period. 0 combat fatalities. Approximately 40,000 individuals treated for various medical conditions by human special forces personnel. 0 combat fatalities. In a military operation that had effectively ended the largest interstellar war in galactic history. Analysis of strategic objectives achieved. All contested territories have been resolved, Admiral, though not through methods our tactical databases have terminology for. Zaxthera's 6 arms moved in the ritual gesture of formal acknowledgement. Clarify resolve. The human forces have withdrawn from all contested systems. Admirals, but they've left behind infrastructure that has made further conflict unnecessary. The holographic display shifted, showing the transformation that had taken place across 17 star systems in the span of 6 weeks. Medical facilities that provided better care than most hegemony core worlds. Educational systems that offered opportunities for advancement regardless of species or political affiliation. Agricultural programs that had eliminated food shortages throughout the contested regions. communication networks that allowed formerly isolated populations to coordinate relief efforts and cultural exchanges. Sub-Commander Zeek-Six-Sivir said slowly, "Are you telling me that the humans have resolved our territorial disputes by making the territories no longer worth fighting over?" "Not exactly, Admiral. They've made the territories worth more when shared than when contested." The implications struck her consciousness like a quantum cascade failure. The humans hadn't conquered hegemony territory. They had transformed it into something that neither side could justify fighting to possess alone. "What are the psychological assessments of our military personnel in the affected regions?" "Morale has improved significantly, Admiral. Medical leave requests are down by 93%. Disciplinary incidents have virtually disappeared. Requests for extended deployment to former conflict zones have increased by 400%. Our soldiers wanted to stay in places where they had been treated as people worthy of care rather than weapons to be deployed." "Admiral," announced the communications officer, "priority transmission from Supreme War Master Nixtharan. He's requesting immediate conference." The hologram resolved, but instead of the ancient Navaxi consciousness she expected, the image showed Nixtharan in his physical form for the first time in decades. A decision that spoke to the profound significance of whatever he was about to communicate. "Zixthara," he began, his voice carrying harmonics she had never heard from him before. "The War Council has reached a decision regarding the human situation. Supreme War Master, we're ending the war." The words hung in the artificial atmosphere of the command chamber like a death sentence for everything the hegemony had believed about the nature of conflict resolution. "Sir, are we negotiating surrender terms?" "No, Ziptura. We're offering them." The distinction was profound. Negotiated surrender implied that both sides had something to gain from cessation of hostilities. Offering surrender terms suggested that one side had achieved such complete strategic dominance that they could dictate conditions to the other. "Supreme War Master, the humans are requesting surrender terms." "No, Zikthara. We're offering them to the humans." The silence that followed was profound enough to hear the quantum fluctuations in the ship's environmental systems. Zixthara felt her biomechanical enhancements pulse with error warnings as her consciousness tried to process what she was hearing. "Sir, I don't understand. The humans have achieved their strategic objectives through non-military means. They've demonstrated capabilities that render our defensive systems obsolete. They've transformed conflict zones into cooperative territories. Why would we offer them surrender terms? Because they've proven something that changes everything we thought we understood about the nature of civilization." Zixithara. Nix Iran's image leaned forward, and she could see in his ancient features something that might have been wonder. "They've proven that true strength isn't the ability to defeat your enemies. It's the ability to transform your enemies into allies." Through her flagship's observation ports, Zixtera could see the lights of human vessels moving in formation with hegemony ships. Not as conquerors and conquered, but as partners working toward common goals. "The terms we're offering are simple," Nuxetherin continued. "Complete integration of humanitarian protocols into hegemony military doctrine, joint administration of all former conflict zones, shared development of medical, educational, and agricultural resources, and formal recognition of human civilization as the senior partner in a new galactic alliance." "Senior partner? They've earned it, Zixithara. Any species that can choose restraint when they possess absolute power has demonstrated wisdom that deserves to guide galactic civilization." The transmission ended, leaving Zixithara alone with the most humbling realization in her species' history. They were surrendering not because they had been defeated, but because they had discovered something worth surrendering to. Colonel Stone stood in the same observation dome where she had watched the lights of Kathminer Prime transform from military installations into centers of cooperation. But now the view encompassed something far more profound: the birth of a new kind of galactic civilization. "Colonel," Major Mendez approached with what had become a familiar expression of quiet amazement. "The final integration reports are complete. Status? All 17 contested systems have been converted to joint administration protocols. Hegemony military forces are requesting training in humanitarian assistance procedures. Their medical corps wants to establish exchange programs with our special operations divisions." Stone nodded. though her attention remained focused on the view beyond the observation dome. Somewhere out there, in star systems that had been battlegrounds 6 weeks ago, former enemies were working together to build something that neither civilization could have achieved alone. There's something else, Colonel. Earth Command is requesting your recommendations for the establishment of formal diplomatic relations with the hegemony. What kind of recommendations? They want to know what we've learned about building sustainable peace with civilizations that approach conflict differently than we do. Stone was quiet for a long moment, considering not just the question but the responsibility that came with being one of the first humans to discover that wars could end with something better than victory. Tell Earth Command that the most important thing we've learned is that peace isn't the absence of conflict. Major, it's the presence of systems that make conflict unnecessary. Systems like what? Medical care that's available to everyone regardless of political affiliation. Educational opportunities that create hope for the future. Economic structures that reward cooperation more than competition. Communication networks that allow different cultures to understand each other. She gestured toward the peaceful light spreading across the planet below. Infrastructure for civilization rather than infrastructure for war. Through the observation dome, they could see the approach of a hegemony diplomatic vessel. The first official embassy from a former enemy that had chosen to become an ally. Colonel, what happens now? Stone smiled, thinking about the reports she had read of similar humanitarian deployments being planned for other regions of the galaxy where conflicts simmered between civilizations that had never learned there were alternatives to warfare. Now we teach the rest of the galaxy what we've learned, Major. We show them that the greatest military victory isn't defeating your enemies, it's discovering that you never had to have enemies in the first place. Dr. Quenthara stood in the pediatric wing of the medical facility that had begun as a human military deployment and had evolved into something unprecedented in galactic history. A joint species institution dedicated to healing rather than harming. The children in her care represented 17 different species, refugees from conflicts that had been resolved through methods their parents' generation had never imagined possible. They played together with the unconscious grace of beings who had never learned that differences in biology or culture were reasons for hostility. Dr. Quenthara, called Major Washington, approaching with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose life's work had exceeded every expectation. We've received approval for the expansion project. Which expansion? The Galactic one. Earth Command and the Hegemony War Council have approved joint humanitarian deployments to 47 systems where active conflicts are ongoing. 47 systems. Hundreds of worlds, billions of lives that might discover, as the Keth Minor system had discovered, that enemies could choose to stop being enemies. Major Washington, can I ask you something? Of course, Doctor. When your people first developed these Special Forces protocols, did you know they would work on this scale? Washington considered the question with the careful thought of someone who understood that the answer would help define how history remembered this transformation. Dr. Quenthara? We knew that every individual has the capacity for both destruction and creation. We knew that most conflicts arise from fear, misunderstanding, and competition for limited resources. We knew that cooperation generally produces better outcomes than competition. She paused, watching a group of children whose species had been at war for centuries now working together to build something whose purpose only they understood. What we discovered is that when you give people the opportunity to choose cooperation over conflict, most of them will make the choice that leads to a better world for their children. Through the medical facility's observation windows, they could see the lights of vessels from dozens of different civilizations moving in coordinated patterns through space. Not military formations, but the organized traffic patterns of a truly integrated galactic community. The real Special Forces operation wasn't what we did to end the war, Washington continued. It was what we learned about preventing future wars from starting. Dr. Quenthara nodded, understanding finally why the humans had called these units Special Forces when their primary mission seemed to be avoiding the use of force entirely. They were special because they had learned something that would change the galaxy forever. That the greatest strength wasn't the ability to win conflicts, but the wisdom to make conflicts unnecessary. And in medical facilities, schools, agricultural centers, and communication networks throughout 47 star systems, that wisdom was spreading like the most benevolent virus in galactic history, transforming enemies into allies, turning former battlefields into cooperative communities and proving that peace was not just the absence of war but the presence of systems that made war obsolete. The universe was vast, but it was no longer violent. The Galactic Institute for Conflict Resolution had become the most prestigious educational institution in known space, drawing students from civilizations that spanned 3 galaxy arms and represented forms of life that challenged every previous assumption about the nature of consciousness. Professor Alexander Stone retired from military service, but not from the mission of teaching others how to transform conflicts into opportunities, stood before a lecture hall filled with beings whose diversity would have been impossible to imagine before the Great Reconciliation. Can anyone tell me what made human special forces unique among military organizations? She asked, beginning the final lecture of the semester. A young Nibvaxi raised one of her cybernetic appendages. Their humanitarian focus? A good answer, but incomplete. Anyone else? A Gorthani student, whose species had once been bred specifically for warfare, offered his perspective. Their interdisciplinary training? The way they combined military capabilities with medical, educational, and engineering specializations. Closer, but still missing the essential element. Professor Stone looked out at her students, former enemies who now worked together to understand the principles that had transformed galactic civilization, and smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose life's work had exceeded every possible expectation. The unique characteristic of human special forces wasn't their humanitarian focus or their interdisciplinary training, she said. It was their understanding that the greatest victory in any conflict is creating a situation where everyone involved wins. A student from one of the newer allied civilizations raised her hand. Professor Stone, how did your species learn that principle? The question hung in the lecture hall like a challenge to everything the galaxy thought it understood about the nature of evolution, survival, and the development of intelligence. We learned it the same way every civilization learns the most important lessons, Stone replied. Through making mistakes, through causing suffering, through discovering that the costs of conflict almost always exceed any possible benefits. She activated the holographic display, showing images from throughout the galaxy, medical facilities, educational institutions, agricultural centers, and communication networks that had grown from the seeds planted during Operation Reconciliation. But we also learned something else that I hope you'll carry forward as you return to your homeworlds and begin your own careers in conflict resolution. The display shifted, showing historical records from the war that had ended not through victory or defeat, but through the revolutionary discovery that wars could be transformed into opportunities for cooperation. We learned that the word special doesn't refer to superior abilities or advanced technology or enhanced training. It refers to the wisdom to choose differently than your instincts tell you to choose. Professor Stone looked out at students whose grandparents had been enemies, whose parents had learned to be allies, and who themselves had grown up in a galaxy where cooperation was the norm rather than the exception. Anyone can be special forces, she concluded. Anyone can choose to respond to conflict with understanding rather than violence. Anyone can decide that their greatest strength lies not in their ability to defeat others, but in their capacity to help others succeed. The lecture hall fell silent as beings from across the galaxy contemplated the implications of what they were learning. Finally, a human student, one of the few in the class, since most human military personnel were deployed on humanitarian missions throughout the expanding alliance, asked the question that would define the next generation of galactic civilization. Professor, what happens when every species in the galaxy learns to think like special forces? Professor Stone's smile carried the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades learning that the greatest questions often contain their own answers. Then we discover what the universe looks like when intelligence evolves beyond the need for conflict, she said. When wisdom becomes more valuable than strength, when cooperation becomes the foundation for a civilization that spans not just stars but the spaces between imagination and possibility. Through the Institute's observation ports, they could see the lights of vessels from hundreds of different civilizations moving through space in coordinated patterns that spoke to purposes beyond anything their ancestors had imagined. Exploration missions to distant galaxies, research projects that combined the knowledge of species whose diversity exceeded the mathematical capabilities of any single world, cultural exchanges that were ripe new forms of art, literature, and music that no single civilization could have developed alone. The war was over. The universe was just beginning. And somewhere in the depths of space, new civilizations were receiving their first contact with the Galactic Alliance. Not through military vessels or territorial demands, but through humanitarian aid missions staffed by beings who had learned the most important lesson in cosmic history: that the greatest force in the universe wasn't the ability to destroy, it was the wisdom to choose not to. The galaxy was vast. It was no longer violent. And it was just the beginning.